Let's now cover the features associated with FreeBSD. We'll log in as the root user for now so that we can move files around without any hindrances. And notice that the login screen appears just like it would within the Linux or Solaris spheres. So open source projects such as GNOME, KDE, etc. largely resemble one another regardless of the underlying distribution or operating system. So we're logged in as a user root, as we can see by the shell, and the name of the system is UCBT 2. Now by default, if you echo shell within a FreeBSD environment, it defaults to the C shell. So this needs to be changed if you want to use a more familiar shell such as the bash shell. Something to keep in mind. Now let's get a session of gedit going. Familiar tools such as gedit, etc. are included with GNOME for FreeBSD. Again, it's cross-platform compatible. So here's our familiar editor, and we'll take some notes regarding the important features of FreeBSD. Now we're working with version 8x, as it's currently the stable version. So FreeBSD features. This is one of the important unices that's out there, as it's a direct descendant of 4.4 BSD. So direct descendant of 4.4 BSD Unix, which means it shares a lot with that particular tree versus many of the Linux distributions that are available today, which are derivatives of System 5. In the 1980s, we saw a large segue of Unix branches, resulting eventually in different Unix distributions, and eventually in the early 1990s, Linux. And the derivatives and the branches are broken and spread across the globe, owned by various corporations and public interests. But nonetheless, the major branches that remain include BSD Unix, Solaris AIX, HP Unix, and Linux. So we're still down to just a handful of important Unix descendants. So the current release is 8.2. This is a fully open source Unix-like OS. We say Unix-like because it isn't the original Unix, which was designed to run on specific hardware platforms, but nonetheless, the tools, the operations, the presentation of the directories, the file system, etc., makes it largely Unix. So it's a fully open source Unix-like OS, and it's licensed under BSD. Insofar as applications are concerned, there are over 22,000 and growing ports or packages available. And you can find out more about the various ports that are available at freebsd.org/ports. Just a quick note about ports and packages. Ports represent source code of popular packages with an easy compilation routine, usually just the execution of make, and make install will provide a particular port on your system and tracked via the package manager included with FreeBSD. So ports represent the source code. What does that mean? Well, oftentimes when you provision software in a Nix-based system, you compile and oftentimes you install binaries. The ports are much more flexible because they're source code, which means you can enable options that are not standard or commonly used with binary packages. So let's just note, facilitates custom compilation options. And it's presented in a straightforward manner because not all options work for all users, so it's important to have this option available. We invariably find ourselves on Linux-based platforms compiling software to our specific needs. So whether it be, for example, one of my favorite NIDS is Snort, where we compile it with specific options for our platform, or otherwise, even the Apache web server, etc., PHP, etc. So if there is software packages that you need to have customized for your platform, for your FreeBSD platform, then you will want to download the port or ports for those packages or for those applications. Compile the options that make sense for your environment. Let's say they're fine-tuning options to allow them to take advantage of, let's say, more resources in the realm of memory disk, etc., and then make it available. Now, as we've mentioned, ports also are represented in the packages database. So FreeBSD manages these ports for you, unlike traditional source code that we find on the internet, such as tar.gz images, in which case you're left on your own to keep track of those various changes. So let's just note that ports are fully managed by the FreeBSD package manager, which means it makes it easy to install, remove, upgrade these various ports. So install, remove, upgrade, manage applications. Much easier when using ports/packages. That leads us to the other implementation or incarnation of applications within FreeBSD, and those are packages. Now, packages represent precompiled binaries of apps. This means the most common or sensible compilation options are applied, which work for most people. So, common compilation options are applied, but it may not be custom enough for your environment. Again, packages are managed by the FreeBSD package managers. So packages, which are basically binary compilations, so binary compilations are fully managed, just like ports, by the FreeBSD package manager. So this basically means that there are two means of implementing applications. So note, there are two means, and in fact there are three, because you can download source code and manage those particular strands yourself, but of course it becomes quite messy if you download too many applications. But there are two main ways to manage applications: ports or source code that you compile, and packages or binaries, and both are managed by the system. So that makes FreeBSD rather flexible with respect to the handling of applications on the system. Now, what else is of interest? There is support, just like with Linux distributions, for numerous hardware architectures. And of course, that means the common architectures are supported, such as the ubiquitous i386, which is largely, of course, 32-bit based, IA64, which of course, as its name implies, is a 64-bit Intel implementation. Perhaps the more common AMD 64, and it is more common not necessarily because of AMD per se, but because the AMD 64 version of FreeBSD will run on AMD 64-bit as well as Intel compatible 64-bit platforms. So in other words, x86 64. So this is 64-bit, and it is also x86 64. And let's just note that you use this branch for AMD/Intel 64-bit, which includes Xeon, Core 2, etc., quad core, etc. So this is possibly the most important branch or platform that's currently being developed for FreeBSD, as well as for Linux for that matter, since these processors are so ubiquitous and rather affordable. But there are, of course, other platforms that may be of interest depending on your environment, and it's important to know, just like with, for example, Debian Linux, that FreeBSD operates on those platforms, and they're listed on the website, but just to name a few, this is not a fully inclusive list, but nonetheless, Alpha. There's still a number of Alpha boxes out there. And the ubiquitous in production environments, mission-critical environments, Spark 64, or Ultra Spark, Sun Microsystems, which is now Oracle. So these are your common platforms, but there are other platforms. For example, ARM for embedded, as well as PowerPC, etc. So let's just note those as well. So ARM, embedded, as well as PowerPC, PC98, and the list goes on and on. But these are the common platforms that FreeBSD will install on. So that means when you search for the sources such as ISO images for installing FreeBSD, you'll be searching for sources that match your particular platform. So an ISO image that matches your platform, or a boot ISO image that will then subsequently be used to access the appropriate platform. But it's important that you get the platform correct because it is hardware specific, processor specific. So what else is of interest? FreeBSD is available as the following strands. Current, which can be considered least buggy. Let's just list these alphabetically. So current, whenever you see current affixed to a FreeBSD release, it can be considered to be the least buggy or the stable version. Beta, which is in between, and snapshot, which can be considered to be the most buggy. A snapshot is the most up-to-date version of FreeBSD that's available, and it's considered to be the most buggy. It changes the most often. So this three-tier system is used: current, beta, snapshot. So for example, currently 8.2 is current. Perhaps by the time you're viewing these videos, 9 is considered to be current, but currently it's 8.2. 9, therefore, is currently beta, and a snapshot would be subsequent releases to 9, or the latest bleeding edge version of 9 would be considered snapshot that you can access if you have the time and the resources to expend to the latest and greatest code available for FreeBSD. And we should also note that for each architecture supported, there are ISO images. So multi-architecture ISO images are provided, which means you simply match your platform to the ISO image of interest and download that particular ISO image to install the operating system or perhaps subsequent applications. FreeBSD also runs, among many other things, Linux binaries. This is very important because Linux is rather pervasive, it's ubiquitous, and as a consequence, if an application does not currently exist for FreeBSD, chances are it is out there in the wild for Linux. And if it's out there in the wild for Linux, then chances are you'll be able to run it on FreeBSD. There's a loadable module for the FreeBSD kernel which allows it to run Linux binaries. So provided via kernel loadable module, or KLM. So the FreeBSD kernel, just like the Linux kernel, is a modular kernel. So FreeBSD kernel, like Linux kernel, is modular, which means not only may you compile options in it, meaning hardwire options in it for various devices, but you may load modules at runtime to provide support for a variety of system settings, such as file systems, or perhaps even binary support for Linux, as we've mentioned. Insofar as installation is concerned, FreeBSD supports a text-based installation via the sysinstall utility, which means graphics are added after. So graphics are added / configured after installation. This keeps the installation footprint rather light. So let's just note, this keeps the installation footprint light, which makes it possible for you to breeze through it and then customize the system to your tastes after the fact. So it's largely a text-based installer with graphics configured after, which means X11 followed by your favorite display manager such as GDM managed by GNOME, etc. Now, insofar as obtaining FreeBSD, it is downloadable via the following options: HTTP, more commonly FTP, and also BitTorrent. There are other means, but these are the three main means of obtaining FreeBSD from the net. You may install FreeBSD entirely across the internet without downloading an ISO image, or download an ISO image, or a combination of the two. For example, we'll install FreeBSD using an ISO image and then install subsequent packages such as X11 via the net using the package add facility. So you can download from the net using HTTP, FTP, BitTorrent. FTP is the most common means of obtaining FreeBSD, so most common. And by most common, we mean the links off of the FreeBSD website direct users to the FTP server, freebsd.org. But there are many mirrors, of course, online where you can obtain FreeBSD, the latest version. Now, it is installable, just like with other operating systems, from the following. Local media, which of course includes CDs, DVDs, USB sticks, etc. And also via the network using common protocols such as FTP, which, as we've mentioned, when you connect to the FreeBSD website, you're defaulted to FTP for obtaining the ISO image or the source tree, as well as NFS. So if you've already downloaded the ISO image and you have the contents, let's say, mounted on one of your servers, need not be FreeBSD, perhaps Linux or otherwise, then you can use NFS to mount the exported directory and install via NFS. Now, that means you will need a minimum boot environment for your system, whether it's a virtual system or a physical system, to connect to the network to be able to take advantage of FTP or NFS. We should also note that during installation, just like with Linux, FreeBSD maintains information on alts F1 and F2. So log information, errors that are detected, scripts that are executed, and the status of each component that is installed are all available via alts F1 and F2. What other features come to mind? For example, with respect to GUI management, we're currently using GNOME. So GUI management, since many users are interested in the GUI, although with mixed-based environments it's less important. However, it's important to note that common desktop environments such as GNOME as well as KDE are supported. There are packages that are available to install GNOME KDE rather easily. And all the dependencies that are required to enable packages such as GNOME and KDE to execute are handled by default when using ports or packages. Productivity tools. And again, this is just largely off the cuff, things that come to mind regarding the usage of FreeBSD. For example, the ubiquitous OpenOffice.org is available. So for those of you who would like to sample using OpenOffice, perhaps on your laptops or desktops for the sake of being productive, or even on your servers, since many of us spend a lot of time in server rooms but need to be productive while in those server rooms or in those data centers, then you can install OpenOffice.org on the server so long as you have GUI access and manipulate your Office-style documents in that particular environment. Now, FreeBSD also manages the boot environment for you, which of course goes without saying. So manages boot environment, and it provides a few options, including the ability to boot by default into FreeBSD without being prompted with a menu. So sans menu. Another option is with a menu. And the other option is to have a third-party bootloader manage the boot. So for example, if you're dual booting, so use during dual boot configuration. Perhaps your other operating system, let's say Windows or Linux, handles the loading of the system, the boot loading of the system, or the bootstrapping of the system. Then you can still, of course, have multiple operating systems, FreeBSD, Linux, FreeBSD, Windows, or even all three, and have the third-party boot manager, boot FreeBSD when necessary by selecting it from the menu. And so far as system requirements are concerned, they're rather meager, which makes it installable on basically every x86 system you can find nowadays. Insofar as processors are concerned, you need a minimum of 486, so 486 minimum, which is not a problem nowadays. And insofar as RAM is concerned, 24 megabytes will do, or greater. But of course, our suggestion is that you run, of course, at least a 1 gigahertz P4 processor or better. And insofar as RAM is concerned, 256 megs or better suggested. And so far as the ever important disk space is concerned, since disk space is so cheap nowadays, it's negligible, but you can install FreeBSD easily within just a couple hundred megs, but we will suggest 1 gigabyte or larger storage to be comfortable that you have ample space to run your system. And by default, the installer sysinstall will lay out your partition for you if you select the auto option. Sysinstall handles the installation and does everything for us, including post-configuration options. So these are basically some important components or features of FreeBSD. Again, it's a direct descendant of 4.4 BSD Unix from the 1980s. There are other variants such as OpenBSD, NetBSD, as well as other Unix style OSs like SunOS, HP Unix, IBM AIX. Those are the main ones, and of course, the ubiquitous Linux. 8.2 is the current release. It's fully open source. Over 22,000 ports or packages are available. You can implement these ports and packages as two different ways of representing applications on your system. Ports represent source code, which allow you to compile non-standard options or tweaked options into the resulting package. And then packages, of course, are binary compilations with sensible options already enabled. Multiple platforms are supported. When you're looking for FreeBSD, you'll see references to current, beta, and snapshot. Least buggy is current, which is 8.2 currently, beta, snapshot. Snapshot being the most buggy because it's almost real-time, if you will, following the development of the operating system. ISOs are available for various platforms. It actually runs Linux binaries. You can download it via the web. Normally via FTP, you can install it using local media across the net. You can manage the system with typical GNOME KDE desktops. And there's productivity. It boots itself, and the system requirements are rather meager to boot the system. Let's save this as UCBT BSD8x notes, which of course is available in the docs pointer or documentation pointer link on the site. So that's a little bit about FreeBSD. So on to the installation of the operating system for our other instance. This is again currently UCBT 2. So let's get another instance going, and then we'll be able to oscillate between the two.